بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So inshallah we'll be covering in this very short course just an overview and introduction to halal food, some general principles, conditions of slaughter, not going into detail, some modern issues, so the idea about fringe opinions, and some practical measures. So principles. Number one, we have to understand that in fiqh, when we're talking about halal and haram, food, we're talking about halal and haram, anything, we're talking about the whole idea about something being allowed, Allah has allowed you to do this, or He's not allowed you to do this. There's a system of rules. There's a system of rules. And in this system of rules, there's something called a default assumption, al-asl. So the default on this is this, the default on this is this. Okay? And so this is part of the system of how fiqh, how the system of halal and haram, food and halal and haram, everything works. That there's something called an asl, a default assumption. And when we doubt, we go back to that default assumption. We're not sure, we go back to that default assumption. And this is a general legal principle, qaida fiqhiyya, that is mentioned by all the scholars mention this. Jalal-Din as-Suyuti mentions it in his book Al-Ashbah al-Nadha'ir. He says, Al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak, that certainty shall not be lifted by doubt. You're certain about something, you stick to that until you have something a new thing they're certain about, a change to that default. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this idea comes in many verses in the Quran, many ahadith. It's something that's throughout the deen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says, indeed, mere conjecture, dhann, means nothing in the face of fact, al-haq, right? So something simply being possible, it doesn't have any bearing on something that we know as fact. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, leave that about which you are doubtful for that about which you are not doubtful. So there's lots of variables in life, lots of variables in the deen, and go to what you're certain about and build from there. Sift out the doubtful things and go to what is yaqeen, what is you're certain about. And in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ was asked a question, what if I'm praying and I don't know how many rak'ahs I've done? Have I done 3 or have I done 4? I'm honestly not sure. And so the Prophet ﷺ replied, he said, he should ignore that about which he is doubtful and build on that which he is certain. So if you're not sure, have you done 3 or 4? Do you know you've done 1? Yes. Do you know you've done 2 rak'ahs? Yes. If you're doubting now 3 or 4, do you know you've done 3 rak'ahs? Yes. Certain? Yes. 100%? Yes. Okay, so where's the doubt in number 4? Have I done 4th rak'ah or not? Okay, leave that one, ignore it, treat it as if it's not there, and do an extra rak'ah. So this is an example of certainty should not be lifted for doubt. Right? Comes up again and again. In Sahih Muslim, with regards to hunting, the Prophet ﷺ was asked, I'm hunting with my hunting dog. I'm hunting edible animals. What if I send my dog and then I find another dog with it and I don't know which one killed it? So I said, Bismillah, and I sent my dog to go and kill this hare, to go and kill this deer, whatever it is. But there's another dog that's not mine. And I didn't send that dog to go there. He just went with him. So the Prophet ﷺ says, don't eat it in that case. That's the answer. Don't eat it. Why? What's the Prophet ﷺ teaching us? Because you only said Allah's name for the dog, for your dog, not the other dog. And you don't know which dog it is, do you? And so it's possible that your dog killed it, and it's possible that the other dog killed it, but you don't know. And so certainty shall not be for doubt. You're not sure? The default is it's haram to eat this animal. Another similar question. The Prophet ﷺ said, when you shoot your arrow, then mention Allah's name. If you then find it dead, eat it. Because what's the default is that you killed it. Unless you find that it has fallen in water. Why? Because you don't know whether it drowned or died from the water. And so there's two possibilities. Did it drown in the water or did it die from the arrow? I'm not sure. Okay, what's the default assumption? Meat is haram. Meat is filth. You can't eat it unless it's been sacrificed properly. Unless it's been slaughtered properly. So the default is no. So here, there's two possibilities. We don't know which way we're going. And so the default assumption is that it is not halal to eat. Imam al-Baji, in his commentary on the Muwatta, he said, if one knows, one of these great Andalusian scholars, he said, if one knows that certain Christians eat unslaughtered meat, one may not eat the meat that they slaughter unless one sees how such a Christian slaughters. If it is known that he may well slaughter an animal in an invalid way, they don't slaughter it properly, one must not eat any animal that dies at his hands unless one knows that the slaughter was done in the valid way. So here we have a Christian. Can we eat Christians' meat? Yes. But there's these Christians and they're not slaughtering properly. Okay, so what's the default then? What would you assume? So the default is meat is haram until proven otherwise. So now with these Christians that you're not sure how they slaughter, he's telling us you got to check if that's the actual case. Prove it positively as opposed to assume that it is halal. Right? So we're going to assume that. So he says if that's not the case, we're going to have to check, because what's the default on meat is that it's haram. So the default assumption on meat is that it is haram. You cannot eat it. There's a meat that's unknown source, whatever it is. Where do you go back to when there's doubt? Where do you go back to? You go back to hurma, that it is sinful to eat it and this thing is filth. That's the default. The default assumption on everything else besides meat, things that are not filthy, is that it is halal. Bread, assumption is that it's halal. Chocolate, the default is halal. Candy, the default is that it's halal. The grass that you pray on outside in the park, the default is that it's pure. That's the default on everything. The default on everything is pure. The default on a cow grazing in the field is that you cannot eat it until it is moved from the state that's in into the state that is edible to eat. You need to know that's the case. Otherwise it's not halal to eat. Now, there's another subtlety. We have to understand that when we're looking at fiqh, the system of halal haram, we're looking at a matrix of three systems. Right? And if this matrix is absent from our mind, you can guarantee that you misunderstand every single fiqh discussion ever. There's three systems that are happening. There are interpretive tools. Al-Qawaid Usuliyya. What is the interpretive method that you have used on the primary text of the Quran and Sunnah? So if you're talking about halal haram and you're not even going to talk about the interpretive principles, we're not even talking about halal haram to begin with. So what are your interpretive principles? That's level A. Level B, positive law, the fiqh itself. Okay, the fiqh itself. So you have fiqh itself, which is the rules of halal and haram. What can you do, what can you not do, what can you eat, what can you not eat. That's the rules themselves. The rituals, how do you do hajj, how do you not do hajj, etc. These are the rules themselves. So you have the interpretive principles, the conclusions. Once you apply those interpretive principles to the primary text, you have the fiqh. And then you have qawaid fiqhiyya, which are legal principles or legal maxims. And so in fiqh, we're working with these three things in tandem. Right? We're working with these three things in tandem. The layman won't see that. Layman just sees fiqh, just sees the conclusion. It's haram to buy a house like this. It is halal to eat this. They just see that. Whereas the faqih sees the three things in tandem. They understand that there are certain interpretive principles that you have assumed in order to make this come to this conclusion. There is a conclusion itself, and there is a legal maxims under which this under which this fiqh applies. These three things happening in one go. And so we notice in fiqh, and we're dealing with this halal and haram business, that we don't always go with certainty. Sometimes there is the asl, the default state, and sometimes we will depart from that default state, not for doubt, but for something that is zahir. They call it al-zahir, ta'arud al-asl ma' al-zahir. Right? There is this conflict between the default state, that something is on, and a new state which is not certain, but it is apparent. Right? They use this word al-zahir, what is apparent. And so we will depart and we will shift from the default, for example with meat, that it is haram to eat, and to the non-default, which is halal to eat, either with certainty, it's clear, you've just seen this animal, he's a Muslim, they slaughtered the animal, Islamically everything's slaughtered, now shifted from an animal that you can't eat to a piece of meat that you can eat. And sometimes we will shift even if it's not yaqeen, if it's not certainty, right? And we'll depart from the default for something that is most apparent, most obvious. And that's either because revelation itself has told us to do that, right? The revelation itself has said, no, ignore the default state and go with what's more apparent, and I'm telling you to do that, A. Or B, because there are strong and measurable indications. So we will depart from the default for these reasons. There are kind of another two scenarios as well, but I won't go into that now. But this is the general picture. And so the first scenario is not so important to us, but an example of that. Right? So what is the default state before the court? Here is Ahmed, and he's being accused of murder. What is the default? What's the default state? The default state is he's innocent. Right? When you make a claim against somebody, the default is they are innocent. So can we depart from this innocence? Yes, we can. How? Well, there are certain cases in courts that we can establish with one witness. Could one witness make a mistake? Yes. So here we have this witness who looks like, apparently he is righteous and upright, and apparently he's known to be righteous and upright, and apparently he has social status to lose. So apparently, if he's going to make a statement in court, he's going to speak the truth. But how can I depart from how can I accuse this person of a crime now, or a financial obligation, when I don't really have evidence, not like concrete evidence? Why? Because the Sharia has told you to do that. There are certain scenarios where Allah has told us, if you have one upright witness for this, one with all the conditions of the shuhud of the witness, then go with that. So here you're departing from the default state to something that is apparently the case, even though it's not really proven. Why? Because Allah has told you to do that. Allah has given you the system. Similarly, we have other scenarios where we have strong and measurable indications. And I'll just give some examples of this, right? Some examples of this, where I'm departing from the default state to the non-default state without clear, concrete evidence. Doubting an integral of a ritual after finishing it. So what's the default? Dhuhr comes in. The default is that I have not prayed Dhuhr, and that Dhuhr is still obligatory upon me. This prayer has come in, and the default state is I haven't prayed it. So if I'm not sure how I prayed it or not, I'm thinking, oh my God, have I prayed Dhuhr or not? Oh man. What's the default? You haven't done it. Okay. So now you come to me after we prayed Dhuhr. And you said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Man, did I do the sujood in the third rak'ah or not? I can't even remember. Subhanallah. Don't know. So now I'm doubting an integral of a ritual after finishing it. So after you finish an act of worship, what's the default? What is this? What is the most apparent thing? The most apparent thing is that now that the act of worship is valid, is that it's complete. And so now you're going to depart from the default, which is you have not prayed Dhuhr and you have not done all these things, And you're going to go to what is most obvious, and that once you've given salams, the prayer is over and you've done. That's now the new default. And so this is an example of departing from the default state to what is more apparent, to what is zahir, right? Based on something that's strong and measurable. Have you given salams or not? Yes. Okay, khalas. And once you give salams, I don't care what you doubt in the prayer, right? Unless you know it's the case. There was a video evidence somebody told you, whatever it is. But after you've given salams, khalas. Before you give salams, yes, the default state is you have not done that thing. So if you doubt it, you go back and do it. So this is an example of departing from the default, which is you haven't prayed the prayer, or you haven't prayed those integrals, you haven't done those things, to assuming that you've completed it, because that's now the new default, right? That's what's apparent now. Another example, a plaintiff claiming that a contract was invalid. So Ahmed and Khalid go to court about some issue, a contract on a house. Ahmed is now making the claim that the contract that they signed was invalid. So where's the default now? Right? The default now is that the contract is valid, because we've agreed that there is a contract. You both agreed that there was a contract, correct? And so the zahir, what is zahir from a contract, is that it is valid. So should we assume, because originally there was no contract, do we go back to the original state, which is there's no contract between these people? Or do we say, no, Ahmed, if you want to prove that the contract is invalid, you now have to prove that. Right? And so here, the fact that you're both coming with a contract, and now one of them is saying, there's claiming that the contract is invalid, that is now what is apparent from the fact that you've bought and sold is that there was a contract, and what is apparent from a contract is that it's valid. That's not necessarily the case. We don't know that, but that's what's apparent. So we're going to depart from the default, which is there's no contract between these people and there's no transfer of ownership, to assuming that there was a contract, and now that has to be disproved. So the plaintiff now is making this claim that the contract is invalid. You're going to have to bring proof now. Because what is apparent, even though it's not the default, what is apparent is that the contract is valid. Another scenario. Here is a woman. She is not sure if her period has started yet. What's the assumption? Then your period has not started. Here's another woman. She's not sure if her period has stopped yet. What's the default? Your period is still going. That's the default. Once something has started, that's now the default. So she knew her period had not started, and she's not sure whether or not it started, so then the default is she hasn't started. Or she's on her period and she's not sure if it's finished yet, then the default is it's still going. That's the default. Okay, what about another scenario then? This woman starts her period, and according to many ulama, the minimum time for a period is 24 hours. 24 hours. If you bleed for less than 24 hours, you're not on your period anyway. So now she's in the first 5 hours of her period. You just said before that the default is that she's not on your period until you are on your period. And you just said that a period is only a period if it's 24 hours. So therefore, she's in doubt until the 24 hours is up. Right? Because it hasn't been 24 hours yet. The new default has not been established. So does that mean she prays for the first 24 hours because the default has not changed yet? No. What is apparent is on your period. So yeah, it could turn out the opposite way. It could be that after 5 hours, there's no blood, and then you're like, oh my God, I didn't actually have a period at all. That's possible, but that's not what's apparent. So what is her obligation is that yes, the default is that you're not on your period until you are on your period. But here you are, it's been at least 15 days since your last period, and it's now you see blood. That's it, you're on your period. So now you're departing from the asl, the default, which is you're not on your period, to another default, which is your on your period, because of evidence, no clear evidence, because it's most apparent, right? So, but it's clear and measurable. Look, there's blood, right? As opposed to, oh, I'm probably at my period. Like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Like, where's your evidence for that? And so what we see here is shifting from certainty to something else in certain scenarios for nigh certainty. For what is dhahir, right? And it's complex because we don't always do that, right? We don't always do that. Okay, sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't, and it's a subtle thing. But the key thing that we need to understand when it comes to halal food is the battle is between the default state and the apparent state, as opposed to the default state and something that is not apparent to begin with. It's not obvious to begin with. It's not realistic to begin with. It's just tawahhum. It's just a possibility. So, take an example of this, explaining this, the certainty not listed by doubt. Jalaluddin Suyuti, he mentions Al-Isfaraini, who said, one of the early Shafis, he said, doubt can be examined from 3 points. So you're doubting something. Doubt regarding something that is by default forbidden. Doubt regarding something that is by default permissible. And doubt regarding something that is of unknown default state. So this thing is haram to begin with. Am I allowed to do it or not? This thing is halal to begin with. This food is halal to begin with. This food is pure to begin with. Right? Or this food is not, right? Or this action is permissible to begin with. And now I'm starting to doubt, well, has that changed or not? And then doubt regarding something that has no known default state. It's unclear, right? That's quite complex. And he says the first is like finding a lamb carcass in a country in which there are both Muslims, i.e. people whose meat you can eat, and Zoroastrians who are people whose meat you cannot eat, right? Like an atheist or something else, right? This is talking in those times, right? So we have to understand in many Muslim countries, particularly for example in Central Asia, there were majority non-Muslims for many centuries at least, right? It was common to find a non-Muslim. You lived among non-Muslims. It's a real thing. He says this would not be permissible to eat until it is positively established. So it is that a Muslim slaughtered it. Since, why? How is he applying it? The default is that it's haram, and we doubt whether or not it was slaughtered in a way that would render the meat halal. So we're not sure. We don't know. So is it possible that a Muslim slaughtered it? Yeah, it's possible. Is it possible that a non-Muslim slaughtered it? It's possible. I don't know. So therefore, what's the default? It's not halal. Can't eat it. That said, if the majority of the population were Muslim, it will be permissible to eat, given that is the most likely turnout of events, and that establishes the norm. Right? This is giving dhuhur. This makes that's now most apparent. So now I'm in this country. It's 70% Muslim, 30% atheists. Okay, here is an abattoir, a slaughterhouse in this country. The meat comes out of that. So is it possible that this slaughterhouse employs atheists? It's possible. Is it possible that it employs Muslims? It's possible. Okay, what's more likely though? Muslims. Okay, so now that's the default. Right. So here, this is an example of departing from certainty, which is you can't eat it, to non-cert, to something else, the default, because it's more likely, the most established. Right. That's now more likely. But notice we're departing between something I know and something that is likely, right, as opposed to simply theoretically possible. Ash-Sharwani, late Darastani scholar, who moved to Mecca, and his works were well known throughout the Middle East, and this is one of the most foremost fatwa works in Sharwani. He says, if there are Zoroastrians, and this is a good example, right? Just as an example, non-Muslims or people who's atheists, whatever it is, and Muslims in a country, and it is unknown whether the slaughterer was Muslim or Zoroastrian, it is not permissible to eat the meat because of the doubt about the validity of the slaughter, and because the default is that meat is permissible. See this system that's coming up again and again and again. This thing about default is very important. Where's the default? However, if the Muslims are more in number, as in Muslim countries, and he's talking about 19th century in Egypt, or perhaps Mecca, then as my teacher has opined, Bajuri, the Sheikh al-Azhar, who passed away, I believe, in 1870, right? It should be deemed halal, right? And this is what we saw as well with Isra'il and others mentioning the same thing. So we have doubt, and we have our default assumption. What is the default assumption on meat? Haram. How does it become halal? Through certainty or through likely. What is likely? How does the situation look? Okay, what about other food? Right? The issue with other food is by default it is halal. Here's some ice cream. What is ice cream? What is cream, sugar, and colorings? I don't know what it is. So what is the assumption? The assumption is that this is pure. That's the assumption. Every single thing is pure, unless something, it becomes obvious that it's not, right? Something becomes obvious. It's known to be like this. It's well established, etc. Right? But the default on everything is pure. And the default on meat is that it is impure and that you can't eat it. Similarly, cross-contamination. Is it possible that there's cross-contamination between halal meat and haram meat? It's possible. What is the default? The default is that halal meat is pure. So when something is simply possible, right? If it's simply possible, then we ignore that. Obviously, it'd be being careful of something else, but I'm not talking about being careful, right? Very important thing. I'm not talking about wara in this class at all. I'm talking about halal and haram. Where does the line of the Sharia stop? Okay? So cross-contamination, is that possible? It's possible, right? But the default is that there's no cross-contamination between meat and other meat, or between this food and that food, and whatever. That's the default, unless you know otherwise. And so why? Because certainty shall not be lifted by doubt. Similarly, I am in this country where there are, I don't know, is this meat halal or haram? So this meat now touches my plate, and this meat now touches my hand. Can I eat this meat? No, I cannot eat this meat. Why? Because I don't know if it's halal or not. I'm not saying it's haram. I'm saying I don't know that it's halal. Okay, when I touch it, is my hand filthy now? Or the plate that was on, is it filthy or not? No. How? Because I don't know that it's filthy, and the default assumption is my hand is pure. So therefore, I treat it that it is haram to eat, because the default is that it's haram to eat, but it cannot make other things filthy, because that's not the default. The default is everything is pure, and so even if it's likely that it's filthy, it can't make other things filthy, because that's not the default. So there's some principles that we're going to refer to shortly. Another key principle that we need to look at is we are not in the 1st century of Islam. You and I are not the first person to ever discuss halal and haram. You and I are not the first person to ever question whether this meat is halal or haram. There are millions of books on halal and haram. Millions. Okay? This has been studied to bits. The systems exist. The discussions are there. Everything has been hashed out. I wouldn't say ad nauseum, because that's not adder, but you know, it's there to the nth degree. Okay, to the nth degree, it's already there. And so the idea that, for example, oh, this is a new issue, we have to really research it, it does come up now and then. But the idea that we're going to just look at the Quran and Sunnah and just, you know, compare it against my situation, as if nobody has looked at the Quran and Sunnah ever before, and as if nobody has ever deduced any principles and meta principles to work with, and as if nobody has been thinking for the last 1,400 years, this is wrong, right? And so the chances are, when you see an answer, your answer is already going to be answered 1,000 years ago, and is either being agreed with or disagreed with. Every single thing, there's nothing new under the sun. And so you have a scenario that comes up today. Follow fiqh fatwas, fiqh verdicts, fatawa, that have been given for centuries. When somebody says this is halal or this is haram, or you can do this, you're going to say, brother, who else has given you this fatwa? How long has that fatwa been there? So here it is, it's well established, it's in all the books of fiqh, there we go, it's well known. As opposed to the sheikh that you'll listen today, right? So notice I'm quoting the books that I'm quoting. Shaykh al-Azhar of 150 years ago or more. Sharwani, super famous name, right? Super famous name, very well known. Al-Baji, this is not some 21st century, 20th century scholar with his own independent opinions. He's working with a framework that exists. He's working with precedent that exists, and he's just putting the material together. And so follow fiqh verdicts that have been there for centuries. Don't come and ask some individual today about their own opinion. Ask how many thousand scholars agree with the fatwa you are being given. Right? There's a hadith, I'll give you an example. There's a hadith that the Prophet forbade selling cats. So there's a khutbah on Friday that why it's haram to sell cats and how the obsession with pets is wrong. And he quotes a sahih hadith that it's haram to sell cats. Simple question at the end of the khutbah, I say, Shaykhana, I have a question for you. How many thousand scholars have given the same fatwa that it's haram to sell cats? In itself, like cats, the legal reason for it being haram to sell cats is it being a cat. And he'll quote one or two scholars in the last 1,400 years. And you're actually going to be in serious doubt whether or not that's true. As opposed to something that's well established. You're like, yeah, it's in this book and this book and this book and this book and this is the discussion. Right? So again, we have to understand, I repeat myself, you are not the first person to ask a question about halal haram, and you won't be the last. And 99.999% of what we deal with today has already been answered, discussed, pros and cons, yes, no, no, yes, it'll be solved. When somebody pulls up with one piece of evidence from here or there, it's like, that's great. But you're not the first person to look at that. There's a whole system behind you. And the people who work in outside of a system, they're very dangerous people. So don't follow fringe opinion of just one person. Don't do that. Ask how many thousand people have said the same thing. Very simple. Right? Because if you do, you're going to be doing Russian roulette. So is there a chance that 99% of people are wrong and this sheikh or this modern scholar or that modern scholar is right? This is theoretically possible. Why not? But we don't play with that in life, with our health, we research things, right? We take responsibility, and we don't play Russian roulette. Right, Russian roulette, the famous mafia game. You get a 6-shooter, put one bullet in it, and spin spin it around, and you've got a 1 in 6 chance of dying. Do we play games like that? We don't play games like that. So we shouldn't play games like that with our halal haram. When you want a fatwa, you say, okay, Sheikh, Jazakumullah khair, is this halal haram? Okay, you give me the answer. Sheikh, how many thousand people agree with you? Simple question. And historically have agreed with you. Of these thousands of, over 1,000 years of scholarship, who agrees with you on this particular issue? Right, you're telling me that, for example, laughing in prayer breaks my wudu. And I Google it and I found evidence against it. And so I ask you, like, well, somebody's going to give an answer and say, yeah, these 1,000 people agree with me. Okay. It doesn't have to be right, but it doesn't sound like it's wrong. Right, that's just an example, right, of something that is well established, researched. Right, and so a lot of these principles that I'm talking about here, these are kind of, they don't really need to be mentioned. They're kind of obvious. But they're not obvious today because we live in a life where we ignore the Turath, we ignore the heritage. And we find some random opinion that's mentioned by some random person, and sometimes we don't know that. It's not our fault. We're just listening to YouTube and that's it, right? And we don't want to play Russian roulette. So don't follow fringe opinions. Stick to the majority. Stick to what you find historically. The fatwa that has been given is this. This is where the safety is. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.